Good evening and welcome to Melbourne Jewish Book Week. I'm Debbie Lee, the Director of Melbourne Jewish Book Week, and I'd like to start this evening by respectfully acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which Melbourne Jewish Book Week is based, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Tonight, we again partner with the Jewish Quarterly to bring you an interview with one of their international contributors in this latest issue, Devorah Baum. Dr. Devorah Baum is Associate Professor at the University of Southampton, where she lectures in English literature and critical theory. She has written several books, including Feeling Jewish and The Jewish Joke, and produced and directed several films. Her next book, entitled On Marriage, will be published later this year. This issue of the Jewish Quarterly includes Devorah's essay on the myth of the Jewish Literary Mafia. Interviewing Devorah tonight is Dr. Andrew Dean, lecturer in writing and literature at Deakin University in Victoria. Andrew published his first academic book, Metafiction and the Post-War Novel, with Oxford University Press in 2021. He's written a number of works on Jewish American writers, including Saul Bellow, Bernard Malamud, and Philip Roth. Andrew won the Landfall Essay Prize in 2021 for an essay about his family and Jewish life in New Zealand and the United Kingdom. Needless to say, Andrew has lived and worked in the United Kingdom, and as it happens, he and Devorah are well acquainted. This should make for an entertaining and stimulating conversation, I've no doubt, and I'm delighted to now hand over to Andrew and Devorah.
Thanks so much, Debbie. Devorah, you can do entertaining, or no, you can do stimulating. I'll do entertaining.
Okay.
I just wanted to, maybe we can start by talking about the book that you review in the Jewish Quarterly, which is Josh Lambert's book, The Literary Mafia: Jews Publishing in Post-War Jewish American Literature. So you've written a review. Would you just mind explaining what the book is about and how you think it might help us to think about that period of writing after the Second World War?
It's about it's called, I've got it here. This is the book. It's called The Literary Mafia, and it turns out that there used to be a period when everybody went on and on and on in America about this literary mafia that was Jewish in American publishing, and some sort of disappointing names showed up in this conspiracy theory with people like Jack Kerouac and Mario Puzo and Truman Capote and so on. They were all moaning a great deal about how you had to get past the Jews in order to get into print, and that the Jews were sort of racketeering in this business, and that they were a mafia. So the kind of stuff we hear today, much more commonly about Hollywood, in this sort of immediate post-war period, it was said about publishing too. It came as a surprise to me. I hadn't heard that before I read this book, and I was sort of pleased to sort of think to myself that I don't sort of wander around bookish circles hearing these sort of stories about how you got to get past the Jewish gatekeepers to get into print. But Josh Lambert's project is a subtle book, and his project is not to dismiss this sort of story of the Jewish mafia, but to look at what underpins it, and to sort of tell it's a kind of history. His book records to look at what happens when a minority of outsiders, as Jews were certainly in publishing before the war, they weren't making such a strong sort of impression on the book industry before the war, but a minority group of outsiders suddenly actually became a very powerful group of insiders in a particular industry, and so they had a kind of cultural enfranchisement, and they made use of it, and so he's recording the story of a kind of ethnic niche, what he calls an ethnic niche within an industry, in this case in the book industry and in publishing, but also sort of the quarterly the magazines, the book prizes, all over the sort of publishing and literary industry in America, and the sort of influence that ethnic niche had. He's saying it's true, there was a strong Jewish presence and ethnic niche in publishing. A lot of Jews were rising into positions of prominence and power, but that doesn't mean it was a conspiracy, and so that doesn't mean they were a mafia. And there are various ways in which he challenges that attitude, one of which is to point out that Jews very often are just as likely to sort of not want to publish Jews as to publish them, or to be hostile to the idea of Jewish letters in one form or another. They're just as often against as they are for each other. And another way in which he challenges the idea of a conspiracy is to point out that actually a lot of different industries have ethnic niches within them, and actually that's probably a good thing in terms of progress. Actually, what we want is more ethnic niches in the culture industries rather than less. And in order to make this case, he's sort of challenging the whole myth of meritocracy, the idea that particularly in a realm such as literature, which is so clearly a subjective realm, the idea that you could just have a sort of meritocratic, the idea that publishers, editors, writers, reviewers and so on, that the idea that they won't have a sort of sensibility that's informed by their cultural background is willfully naive. And it's that attitude, the belief, the sort of naive faith in a meritocracy that could hold progress back in terms of widening participation and so on. So that's his sort of take.
Yeah, and I want to sort of come back on some of those things, think about who he's talking about, but I'm interested in that term that you quoted him as using, which is cultural enfranchisement. And one of the things you talk about a little bit in your review, and certainly in Lambert talks about in his book, is the distinction between cultural enfranchisement and nepotism. How do you sort of see that playing out in the book? Because I think that's probably one of the automatic responses we might have when we hear of a group of people who operate in a particular industry and tend, hiring or being involved with people who are their friends in some way.
Well, I suppose nepotism, I think, tends to be about individuals advancing personal interests rather than group interests, because of who they know and so on, and they're not necessarily qualified to do what they're doing, but they knew the right people and so on. And there is some of that in the story he tells about cultural enfranchisement too. There is a who you know type series of situation, but this isn't in order to put people in positions that they're ill qualified to have, or it's really about the way in which, in order to sort of enter into a culture and make it meaningful, the idea of a Jewish, I mean, it's extraordinary what happened after the Second World War in terms of Jewish writing, Jewish letters, Jewish sensibility. That became something Americans got to know. And it was so outsider before that time. And then, I mean, you have truly great figures in the American literary canon that have Jewish backgrounds, Jewish names, and write about Jewish themes. And that we're talking about Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Bernard Malamed, Cynthia Ozick, Grace Petty, the people that I know you work on as well. These are extraordinary figures to have emerged, but they probably couldn't and wouldn't have emerged had there not been people in positions of influence and power in the publishing industry at that time who recognized what they were bringing to the table. And so cultural enfranchisement is really a story about how a wider culture begins to sort of open itself up to new stories, to new sensibilities, to new ideas, to new histories. And in order to achieve that, it can't be about tokenism, about one person sort of getting represented here and there and creating a sort of an appearance of diversity, where actually it really needs to go all the way down and through the system. And nepotism, I think, it is part of that story, in the sense that who you know counts, but it isn't the whole story, and it's actually a sort of a bit of a red herring if you're gonna follow that theme.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that comes across really clearly in the book is that you also have hotly disputed questions about what should and should not be published, what quality looks like in an environment where there are new terms for understanding what it means to write as an American. And as you pointed out, examples of authors being rejected on the basis of being, sort of too Jewish, or maybe there's sometimes a resistance to other writers, Jewish resistance to other writers writing about Jewish themes. So certainly the complexity is there, and the best example of that was the Ralph Ellison example that you draw on in your review. Would you mind talking about that for a moment?
It's a wonderful anecdote. The kind of thing when I mentioned in my review that this is, and one of the things I love about American Jewish writing is it's so unapologetically Jewish, and it seems so unafraid of being Jewish, and there's a real warts and all type sort of characterization going on. And I mean, in the case of Roth, he very often includes the voice of the elders going, you mustn't make Jews. I mean, that sort of fear, that sort of old world fear is imported into the new world and expressed through the voice of the elders going, you mustn't portray Jews like this. We must just paint pretty pictures of ourselves. Otherwise, who knows what may happen. And I'm much closer to those old world figures in the Philip Roth sort of text than the sort of new world Jew is. I'm always very anxious about how Jews appear, and terrified that it might sort of lead to God knows what, even though I myself don't always appear as I should, perhaps, according to those guidelines. But in this case, there is actually totally forgotten why I went in that direction. Totally forgotten that. I got lost inside that and forgotten the anecdote. But so it's talking about the idea of how Jews might be considered to be advancing kind of Jewish interests and Jewish stories and so on. And so when I pick up a book called The Literary Mafia and it says it was about Jews, I'm nervous about what stories I'm going to find there. I'm nervous that there's going to be a terrifying proof that something awful has gone on in my name, in my history. And then when I find the opposite stories I really like, I'm so delighted. So I found quite a few of stories that truly delighted me in this book, and one of them was about literary prizes and whether or not, because quite a lot of things like the National Book Award were won again and again and again over a certain period by Jewish writers and Jewish books. And so there's a question, was this because Jewish judges were on the panels and they were awarding prizes which do huge things for books? I mean, it's really how you make a lot of money in the book industry, winning prizes. Were Jews awarding prizes? Were Jews sort of getting together and advancing Jewish interests in publishing through the prize system? And the answer to that was no, that actually, on the whole, pretty much whenever a Jewish writer won a Jewish prize, won a book prize, the panel had not been Jewish. They weren't even from New York. They had just genuinely been interested in this new voice, this new literature. But there was one case where it did look like there were 3 Jewish judges on the panel, and it did look like their shared sensibility as Jews had fought off the other judges to award the prize to a particular book, but not to a Jewish writer. And there was a Jewish title on that short list, and there was William Carlos Williams, and I think there was Hemingway on that short list, but they gave the prize to Ralph Ellison and his extraordinary novel, The Invisible Man. And that novel is, I think, one of the most important novels in the history of African American literature, and in terms of cultural enfranchisement, in terms of putting African American literature on the map. And the biographer of Ellison said Ellison was very lucky that he had 3 progressive Jews on the judging panel, 2 of whom were his friends. And so there was a sort of sense in which a shared ethnic sensibility, not the same ethnicity, but the sense of outsideness that goes with trying to put new realities and stories and perspectives into the canon of literature, of what's considered to be literature, may well have swung the prize, that the Jewishness of that judging panel may well have led to the prize being awarded to a particular work, but not a work by a Jewish writer, a work by an African-American writer. So I love that anecdote.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more work to be done on the relationships between African-American and Jewish American writers in that period as they develop, opposing and connected at times, voices of kind of dialectical voices. And you can see that with works like Bernard Malamud's The Tenant, which is a very strange novel, which kind of reflecting on that later in the period from the 70s. But I want to return to something that you said in your just before, which was about, you said balls to the wall, which is from your review, and you said, I'll quote from the review here: "The provocation of the actual title slightly unnerved me as an angst-ridden European rather than a balls to the wall American Jew. Even before I read the first page and learned about that the alleged existence of a Jewish literary mafia was a constant complaint of various American authors whom I had never suspected of saying such things before." Now, I'm really interested in your phrasing there, balls to the wall and angst-ridden. Because one of the things that I think makes these writers so special, the writers that actually Lambert doesn't talk so much about, but that you mentioned, Paley, Roth, Ozek, Bellow, Malamud, and so on, is their balls to the wall treatment of angst, that they give that kind of American treatment to being a Jew, or to being Jewish. And that's what kind of marks it out in some way in my mind. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when I wrote a book called Feeling Jewish, and Feeling Jewish, the titles of each chapter in that book don't sound very positive. So self-hatred, envy, guilt, paranoia, this kind of hysteria, this kind of thing. And essentially you could say it's sort of autobiography by other means. I mean, it's just a portrait I'm painting of myself. But in order to paint that portrait of myself, I'm actually making a much larger argument about modernity and about the kind of affects that go with being any kind of self in the modern world. And I'm making a case that the sort of Jewish history and modernity for Jews was a kind of an advance guard to a kind of modern sensibility. And we see this in Sigmund Freud's intervention into sort of creating a kind of almost a sort of science of feeling in the modern period, analyzing feelings and so on, and the unease around them in the modern period when supposedly everyone is enfranchised and everyone culturally enfranchised and everyone has opportunities and everyone has liberties, but how secure do they really feel? And Jews, of course, weren't wrong to suspect that modernity wasn't going to be all it promised, and had a lot of insecurity. So a kind of stereotype of Jews arose in literature, and also to some extent through various other discourses, including psychoanalysis, that portrayed Jews as hysterical, neurotic, nervous, anxious, paranoid, and guilt-ridden, and self-hating, and so on. And these are feelings that are very difficult to admit. And so in a situation where you're not very confident about your mode of belonging, you're unlikely to make a song and dance about them. In America, however, there was a lot more freedom and a lot more liberty, I think, to dig into these feelings, to admit them, to express them. And so it was very strange for me. So in a place where there was sort of less nervousness, really, there was more opportunity to share that nervousness in the writing and so on. And it was also about historical transmission and intergenerational stuff for a lot of these writers. Are we going to be weighed down by the old world? Are we going to create something new here? And you see that in a lot of their stories. And so it was a very strange book to write, because in some ways I was talking about what is quintessentially, I think, quite a European sensibility, a European Jewish sensibility in the modern period, but finding its best expression over in America. And so I took the book over to America, where everybody said to me, and it came out in America first, actually, with Yale. And everybody said to me, oh, this book will go down so well in America because people aren't afraid to be Jewish there and they can express their Jewishness there. But I went there and I was like, self-hatred, envy, guilt. And they were like, no, pride, joy. We do not feel those things. I was like, oh, those aren't my feelings at all. I don't have those positive ones.
I want to talk a lot more with you about Feeling Jewish, which is a great book. You know, it's one that has been hugely influential on me in all kinds of ways. But so as you said, that book involves these chapter titles like Mother Love or Over the Top, or I think Envy is one, isn't it, and Guilt's another. And as you say, there are all kinds of negative affects. But alongside that, you wrote this other book, which was this joke book. And we begin, from what I remember, with the joke, Jews are just like everyone else, only more so. I just wonder if there's a connection between, if maybe you could explain the connection between those two parts of your work, the seeming negative affects of Jewish life that you describe, and with chutzpah, and the elements of play that we might expect or associate with joking. It seems like, because those two books came out around the same time, they make in some ways quite similar arguments. I just wondering if you could maybe explain that. Because I think it also has a bearing on some of the things that we were just saying about writing, giving the American treatment of being Jewish from these writers.
Yeah, I mean, those writers, are nearly all comic writers, actually. I mean, in fact, they are all comic writers that we've just mentioned. It would be, particularly Paley for me is an extraordinarily, she's just got an amazingly comic sensibility. But so does Ozick, obviously, so does Roth, so does Bellow, so does Malamed. They're all comic writers, actually. So, the sense of, one thing I often try to point out is actually, it wasn't that long ago that the word humor really did refer to both feeling and a sense of the funny. The word humor links those two sort of apparently discrete domains very well. In the medieval period, you were talking about the humors. You're really talking about your emotional modalities and the kind of sort of emotional disposition you have. So and I find that there's a great deal in common. But for one thing, we speak of a sense of humor. It's a very strange sense. What is this sense of humor? It's a sense that I think I wouldn't be the only person to point out that seems to have characterized Jewish modernity in a lot of, say, the idea of the funny Jew, the neurotic Jew, the comical Jew, even on books about humor that have no intention of sort of referencing Judaism. You often get that sort of Groucho Marx image, the idea that sort of humor is a sort of template Jewish sort of figure, is a trope, actually, outside of Jewish humor as well. And a lot of particularly American, I think, sort of TV shows, comedy, things like Seinfeld, things like Curb Your Enthusiasm, and so on. This is how we've seen American humor go very, very mainstream, but we can recognize it as coming from a sort of distinctly Jewish place, a Jewish sensibility. So humor and funniness, I think, is a sort of sign of, again, of a kind of nervousness. For me, all laughter is a kind of nervous laughter. Even when it looks like really vicious, sadistic laughter, I think there's a kind of nervousness inside it, a sense that at the borders, you never quite know what's going on, where your nerve endings are. And so humor is always testing boundaries. It's always testing borders. There's a kind of energy inside any comic that they hear that they're not allowed to say something, that there's something they're not meant to touch, a sacred cow, and something moves them into that place where they want to see how far they can go just here. So at the borders where your nerves are, you find this sense of humor, but you find all the senses, actually.
It's interesting that you say at the borders, because, you know, one of the things that is striking about, I think, really all of your work is that you have this emphasis on the Jew as someone who crosses over, someone who feels alienated even from themselves. You know, you could say this is a model of the Jew as a stranger in a strange land. And I'm thinking about, I think it's in Feeling Jewish, you quote Adam Phillips saying that Freud understood the human as an immigrant. So an immigrant even to oneself, where you are kind of constantly crossing borders that you yourself are establishing, or that have been established for you by cultural scripts or childhood experience or whatever. It's interesting that you do that, because I think one of the things that you touched on when you talked about the potential for a more difficult American reception for your work is, and not just American, is a model of the Jew is actually fully self-realized, which is the opposite of this. Maybe what we're talking about is a particular version of kind of diasporic Jewishness, where as opposed to the figure of the Jew as something to be asserted, defended, known, understood, and to be proud of. You know, to the opposite of nervousness. So I just wondered if you had something to say about that. You know, these opposing.
Yeah, I don't like the idea of self-realization. I never have. It seems like a sad thing to do with oneself. Just realize it and then just live in that realization. And so I'm fully realized and just meet the real me. Here I am, and then so on. But I think there is something in American ideology that pushes one to sort of envisage that as a possibility. But the idea of the individual's manifest destiny, and again coming back again, not so much the idea of the group, but the idea of the individual as not dependent on others, actually, for their own. I mean, or denying that dependency in some way. In my book, I should say, I think Feeling Jewish isn't the Jewish joke. It's not a joke, but there are jokes in it, and I try to show that there's lightness in what sound like negative. I try to make a case for self-hatred as not as bad as it sounds. I mean, I suffer from it. It is a form of suffering, but it's not as bad as it sounds, because I think inside it is a kind of resistance to a world that wants to say and to tell you who you are, to say, who are you? Show me your identity card, and that is definitely who you are. I subscribe to Adam Phillips' characterization of the Freudian human as an immigrant, but by immigrant that means somebody who is never sort of sure of themselves or where they belong, is always going to be sort of transient in some way or developing. I mean, Freud made this move himself of sort of saying the sort of outcasts and the pariahs that were being treated in sort of the hospital for the insane and so on, that actually their psychopathologies would prove to be those of the mainstream as well. That actually we don't move from the center out to the margins. Actually, it's the margins who tell us what's really going on, those who imagine they're at the center. And of course, we're in one of the sort of arguments of Feeling Jewish is that modernity appeared to be about, and particularly post-enlightenment appeared to be about, sort of enfranchising everybody and saying everybody can now move into the center. But what actually happened seems to have been the opposite, that increasingly, and we're seeing it more now than ever, everybody feels they're marginalized. Every group, every person, everybody feels they're sort of been taken away from the center. And there's a lot of rage and a lot of hysterical feelings around that. But it shows that, you know, we aren't self-realizable. And what can we do with that?
Yes. Your this characterization that you have of the outside coming in is one that I've used certainly with my students to describe the profundity of recognizing that those in the hospital, the neurotics, the hysterics, are those that might actually tell us what it means to be a human. And that's Freud's kind of one of Freud's great breakthroughs and sort of forms of self-forgiving, and something that something that seems to open up an opportunity for people after this great catastrophe, in particular the First World War. But I want to pick up on what you just said about everybody feeling marginalized. I've got another quote from your book, which is this: "Today, everyone, even Tom and Dick, appears inclined to feel, if not existentially threatened, then at the very least marginalized. The proliferation of these Jewish feelings, then, can be observed not only from the marginal positions of race, migration, gender, class, or sexuality, whose trajectories might be said to structurally resemble the Jewish one, but to entire segments of the Western populace." Now, I want to ask, sort of in line with what we've been talking about, then, I mean, are we really all Jews? Because I'm recalling this offhand comment you once made to me, which is that you wrote a book saying that everyone was Jewish. Then you found out afterwards, because they wrote you letters and posted on Reddit or whatever, that they were not. Then you said, as you often say, well, that's just what they thought.
Yeah, if only people would realize. The subtitle of Feeling Jewish is a book for just about anyone, and it's funny, I've just got a new film that's just out now, and there's a moment where I'm it's a film in which it's a crazy film called Husband, in which I'm on a book tour in America, releasing that book, Feeling Jewish, and there's a scene in which I'm really very angry because I'm in my bed preparing for an event which I'm finding scary, a book event I'm finding scary. I'm just trying to read my book and get ready, get into the headspace, and I'm no makeup, no hair. I don't want a camera on me. But sure enough, the husband comes in with the camera, and it's very interesting. I look up at him and I say, I wrote this book and say this is a book for just about everyone, and the argument is everyone feels just like me. But now I'm in America, I realize nobody feels like me, even I don't. so there was a kind of strange sort of feeling when I got there that nobody feels Jewish here. Not the Jews feel the least Jewish people I've ever met, and even I appear no longer to be Jewish. So it was a bit disappointing for my thesis. But I'm able now to have another look at that, and I can see I'm very nervous. I'm just as Jewish as I always was, and look, one thing I really love in Philip Roth is a really key figure and voice in that book. One thing I really love about Roth and his work is obviously he spent quite a bit of time in England as well, and he was really frustrated by the shame surrounding Jewishness in England. The way in which he said, whenever, in one of his books, he says, whenever people say the word Jew, they don't say it, they whisper, did you know they were Jewish? Like as if they're sort of naming cancer or something. Did you know they have Jewishness? And he was so overwhelmed at how sort of shocking it was to find himself in a place where you couldn't say the word Jew aloud, that he said he had to go back to America just to be with these shameless Jews who could. But then Roth also doesn't like proclamations, so he also doesn't really like it in America, where people sort of go out saying Jewish, 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 as if they know what that is, as if they know what that means, because he thinks actually the truth of any subject position is splitness. So whether you whisper the word in shame or you proclaim it in an unapologetic and unashamed way, you've traduced it. You've traduced the truth of that experience, which is a kind of energy that we can call nervousness, again, because it's about sort of context and situations and testing things out and not being self-realized. It's a sort of sensibility again. I want to come back to that term, sensibility. And in my joke book, I sort of I conclude really with a thesis about why the word Jew might just be funny in itself, could in itself by itself be a joke without any sort of preamble. Just the word Jew would be a joke all by itself, as if Jewishness is a joke all by itself in a way. And I mentioned, I think, a Jackie Mason sketch where he used to go out and stand on a stage and just say the word Jew again and again and again. And just say the word Jew, nothing else, just say the word Jew and again and again and again. And then the audiences would divide very quickly into Jews who would be like rolling in the aisles, crying with hysteria. Hearing this word Jew just said again and again and again just made them so absolutely hysterical. And everybody else wouldn't be thinking, I don't get this joke. What's the joke? I don't get the joke. I'm feeling very anxious in a different way, maybe an anxiety of outsiderliness in a way about not getting the joke. But the point there isn't that the Jews do get the joke. They don't know why that word's so funny either. But they know it. They have kind of freedom to find the hysteria in it, and I think that's an amazing sort of test case of what that word can do.
Yeah, one of the things you're getting at there is the transgressive qualities of that kind of comedy, which seems to be aligned with the thing that we can't say, and that's similar with Roth. You know, everybody dropping their voice. He says, I think this is in The Counterlife, isn't it? When he goes to England and there's or is it Deception? It's Deception.
No, it's Deception. Yes, yeah.
The Counterlife has that chapter in England with Maria in a kind of small country town or something. I remember finding that absolutely hysterical when I first read it because I was living in the UK. And this feeling of everybody looking at him. But anyway, sorry, just to go back to the transgression thing, is that there seems, I guess one of the things you're getting at when you're talking about the qualities of the comic with, you know, Jackie Mason just saying the word Jew over and over, it's the thing that can't be said or the thing that can't be named. I'm thinking of that joke by Joan Rivers, the one when she saw Heidi Klum walking down the catwalk. Do you know this one? I mean, you know, I'm putting on asbestos gloves to tell this joke. I'm not. This is not coming from me. This is Joan Rivers's joke. Where she said, I haven't seen anybody looking so hot I haven't seen a German looking so hot since they were forcing my ancestors into the oven. And that's something like that. You know, it's a Holocaust joke, and it was highly controversial, of course, at the time. And it seemed like it cut along a particular kind of transgressive axis. And it involves this division between self-realization, what can and can't be said, and also those who might find it funny, who think of this as a more, you know, who find in that transgressive space resources of pleasure. I just wonder.
She's also my sense with a joke like that is, I think she's also indexing for the world, really. It's not conscious, it's not deliberate, but I think she's also testifying to how much darkness there is inside her. How no matter what she sees, the most superficial kind of templates of culture, she sort of it arouses a kind of historical darkness that just sort of leaps out of her, so that it's always connected. So again, it seems it's taboo because it seems like it's a joke about the Holocaust is being found funny, but no, the Holocaust is being found resonant, I think, and ever present, and various other kinds of associations one could begin to make with superficial template culture and the kinds of dark histories that have been bequeathed to us.
And also acceptable ways of understanding them. I mean, I'm remembering a moment in a Roth novel, I think it's Sabbath Theatre, where we have pages and pages of rage at the wife, who's very much like Claire Bloom, because she refuses to leave the body of the mother and where she's died, and this wife figure is staying in the room, and Sabbath is getting angrier and angrier at her for not having left the room. You know, she has dinner with the mother, with the body of the mother. She'll kind of walk out of the room to go to the bathroom, but come rushing back in to make sure she's still there. you're sympathizing with Sabbath as this thing goes on, and then you get to the end of the chapter, and he says, as if it were her and not death that had gone too far.
Mm-hmm.
There's the sense that actually maybe the thing that is being named in a moment like that is the truly transgressive, the thing that we can't quite assimilate. But anyway, one of the things that so we're talking about this in various ways already about Freud and self-help and so on. You're editing this book, the Handbook of Psychoanalysis and Jewish Studies. And I'm just going to draw out another quote from Feeling Jewish, which kind of touches on, I think, some of the things we've been talking about, which is this. You say, my interpretation of feelings is accordingly not guided by the notion of self-help or the pursuit of happiness. The Freud who will aid my analyses is a thinker for whom feelings and their ambivalences are never wholly good or bad, right or wrong, just or unjust, or ever just one thing. Feelings invariably contain and threaten to become their own opposites. Thus, love is a form of hate, lust is a form of disgust, desire a form of fear, passivity has something of aggression in it, and vice versa. I find this a humane move that you make in your work. Often you find the thing that is sitting on the other side of the feeling. So, for example, with that joke, you're finding the historical darkness that is being named in that moment, as opposed to being sort of in the first instance upset by it. I'm just wondering how Freud is helping you to get there, because I think Freud is having this real moment at the moment. Where there's that new magazine, Freud-inspired magazine, Parapraxis, which was covered in Vulture magazine. I mean, there's something about Freud at the moment that seems to enable us, it's like a technology, to get to this, to these ambivalences, to find something that is always already opposed and self-divided. Yeah, just wondering if you had anything to say about that.
I mean, Freud would be the first to. Freud is the one who's theorized in advance the idea that Freud would be likely to go away and come back and go away and go away and come back, because this is what we do with truth. This is what we do. We hear it, we know it, then we repress it, we don't know it, and we hear it again, and we know it again. Truth is maybe a loaded term. Freud has some ideas that come and go. And I think at moments of hysteria, and we're living through a moment of hysteria, they come back, because the return of the repressed is everywhere around us. It's you'd have to really have your head in the ground not to notice history returning in some of its most sort of terrifying forms, specters from the past coming back and haunting again. And again, one of Freud is hugely important also when I think about joking, and he wrote a book about jokes, and most of the jokes he tells in that book are Jewish jokes or as examples of humor. But the thing about a joke is it's a really good sort of proof of the fact that we don't know what we think we do. So when you hear a joke and you laugh at it, it's not because you got it, actually. It's because you sort of suddenly realize that you never did get it. The laughter is a kind of eruption. It's sort of outside. It's a sort of it's beyond language. It's like tears, laughter. There's a slight sort of sense, my cognition sort of ended there, and that surprise, that sort of element of surprise, shows me I never really got this. And then you hear that same joke again, and you laugh again. Oh, you got it, again, it turns out you still don't know this thing. So a joke is a sort of endless sort of proof that you don't know what you think you do. And it's not just when it surprises you, you can have heard it again and again, but you still don't know it. And so I think Freud, for me, is he's not the only figure for me, but he's one of the most important figures in reminding us that we don't know anything. We don't know ourselves. We don't know what motivates us. And particularly when we think we do, that's when we really don't.
I mean, I'm thinking that bit at the end of his book on jokes, where he says, it's a very strange, this is a hugely influential book on me, and it's one of the first things I read when I began working on comedy, and I found it, remarkable, swinging between cultural critique and kind of his systematics. And the systematics I'm not as interested in, but the other thinking is very much, I find hugely enriching. And he says that bit at the end, got a quote here: "The euphoria which we endeavor to reach by telling and laughing at jokes is nothing other than the mood of a period of life in which we are accustomed to deal with our psychical work in general with a small expenditure of energy, the mood of our childhood, when we were ignorant of the comic, when we were incapable of jokes, and when we had no need of humor to make us feel happy in our life."
It's such a beautiful conclusion. Because he's saying, and we saw this, that actually infants have a great sense of humor. That but they just find stuff funny, and they have fun, and they find stuff funny without any need for jokes. So for Freud, the joke comes along, and there's a tragic dimension to it, because it's about a paradise lost. That we used to have this mirthfulness without the need for telling jokes, and now we try to recover it in a sort of through language games and other forms of play, but it's a really extraordinary ending, because a lot of what Freud is saying before that is that a lot of humor is sadistic, and a lot of humor is what he would call, a lot of jokes are what he would call tendentious. There are victims, and the language of jokes, punch lines, slapstick, is we can hear the sadism within it, and when the punching up, punching down, or just punching, is the fact that the archetypal joke is watching somebody slip on a banana skin. They hurt themselves, you didn't, ha ha ha, like laughing at another person, something. It doesn't sound so innocent and sweet and full of mirth. But I think Freud's argument is, even inside all of that, is this attempt to recapture a kind of ebullience, a kind of mirthfulness that is our sort of birthright, that we're trying to bring back to ourselves through the uses of humor. It's a beautiful ending.
Yeah, and it also seems to say something about the emergent into consciousness as a form of division, where we find that we're surrounded by these. We're in order to manifest mirth, we have to kind of recognize that dividedness, which looks an awful lot like the practice of therapy, the return to childhood. Maybe we'll come back to that. The one thing so we're talking a lot about these Jewish fathers, Freud in particular. Maybe in your work, Derrida and Kafka are kind of great uncles or something. But I was wondering if there might be a matrilineal line of descent. As we all know, this is the more important one in your work. And I was thinking about who the Jewish mothers might be, writers who you draw on again and again. And I was thinking of two in particular. One might be Jacqueline Rose, and another Lisa Apognanesi. And I was just wondering if you might say something about your reading of their work and how that's influenced you.
Goodness, it's so interesting. You said, well, obviously, I should confess that in the case of Lisa Apognanesi, she's literally my mother-in-law. So there's that, and so I can, if I want, call her mother and get away with it. Jacqueline, I also know personally, and she's got a book. I did in conversation with her actually about her book called Mothers. So it gets very incestuous, and her book called Mothers is a marvelous book, and has so many profound insights, and also shares some ground actually with my book on mother love, my chapter on mother love in Feeling Jewish. But it's interesting because in my new book on marriage, I have marriage is a curious institution, because it's traditionally a patriarchal institution, and we can see that in all kinds of ways, not least through the fact that historically it's been a heterosexual institution in which women have had their names taken over by that of the man, the patronym. So women have married, and then the father's name was their name, and now it's the husband's name, and that's their name, and their identity is completely colonized by the man, and then they start making babies and so on that goes into the name of the man, the name of the father, and so on. So it looks like a very patriarchal institution, and in many ways, of course, it has been and remains in that way. But marriage as a subject has been remarkably associated with women and women's writing, perhaps because they've tried to figure out their own place in this institution that has dominated their life choices and dominated everything they create and so on for most of history. But women have had a lot of very interesting things to say about marriage. I would say that the novel as a form has been overwhelmingly determined by the marriage plot, and even we can think of people like Jane Austen and George Eliot in this regard, but you know, we can also think of Tolstoy and Dickens and Henry James and putting sort of the story of the woman who may or may not get married at the center of narrative itself, making that the story that we have to look into. So the word matrimony seems to link to maternity and link to the experience of the mother and women's creativity in one way or another. And so in my new book, I not only do refer to my mother-in-law and her work, and again I refer to Adrienne Rich, another Jewish mother who's written about maternity and marriage and various things and Jewishness, but I also interview my own mother, who spent many years as a marriage guidance counselor, that then became a couples counselor, and so had some sort of insider secret stories, the lesser told stories about the experiences of women throughout history, and particularly women, not just women, and so those are in my work. And I would say I think I'm hugely influenced by literally my own mother and my mother-in-law and all these other great writers.
So I know that's a difficult question to ask you to comment on your mother-in-law. However, it's just it sort of strikes me when I think about kind of British Jewish studies and its kind of more theoretical orientation. When I think of the kinds of writers that I am reading and who I'm who I can see connections with, of course, your work, Lisa Appignanesi's work, Jacqueline Rose's work, some of the others that you've mentioned. I mean, there's a kind of I would say almost a going out from the consulting room, from scholarship and into culture in a way that I find hugely enriching, and actually a little bit unusual. I think this is a particular practice that's associated with quite a small group of mainly women writers, Jewish women writers in London. I just wondered if you had any more thoughts about that, or.
Yeah, I think it's in the case of all these women that you're mentioning, psychoanalysis is in the background of I mean, certainly Jacqueline Rose is a brilliant psychoanalytic thinker and feminist thinker, and the same with Lisa Appignanesi. And I think we can find traces of that kind of project in Adrienne Rich too, and whoever else we're thinking about. So I think it's an attempt to see what appear like sort of scholarly considerations, philosophical topics, maybe slightly rarefied or esoteric topics, as at the beating heart of life. That they couldn't be more urgent. It couldn't be more important that we started conversations with everybody, and that it is possible to take deep thought, deep reading, deep scholarship, and find a way to communicate it, because these things matter. People's feelings matter. Their ways of being in the world matter. And so these discourses, shouldn't be left inside the academy. Well, I see no reason why they should be only spoken there.
I mean, I totally agree. And I think, I'm thinking about some of the works that, for example, Jacqueline Rose's work on trans politics, trans writing, some of the ways that she describes being alien from oneself is already the condition of being a woman. I found that particularly convincing and actually exciting for trying to address some of the debates that are exactly around these questions of self-realization, self-actualization, and the damage that can cause when one imagines oneself to already know what one is in particular ways. I'm thinking more about the the trans exclusion line. So now, having now asked you about intellectual mothers, I just want to read you something that you wrote in Feeling Jewish, which is the mother, whether seen as monstrous or as magical, is a kind of boundary exploding figure whose sense of alienness, even to herself, reminds us of the way in which the features once said to characterize modern diasporic Jews, transience, secrecy, shape-shifting, saw them face the Jewish question, which they were unable to adequately answer, rendering them subject to increased levels of scrutiny and surveillance alongside ever tighter systems of social and political control. I was wondering if you might sort of elaborate on, the sense of self-alienation that connects this thing that you're talking about, motherhood and the experience of being Jewish.
I mean, the Jewish mother is the punchline to a lot of jokes, and her stereotype, overbearing, emotionally blackmailing, just too much, where even the love is a kind of pathology. That a child would. I mean, Portnoy's complaint is a whole joke about the Jewish mother in some ways. All of those things are sort of viciously imposed on her, and we can see in that rendering both anti-Semitism and misogyny coming together very nicely in that stereotype. But I mean, I would say that those stereotypes are also the stereotypes of modern Jews. Too much, hysterical, guilt, neurotic, and so on, paranoid, all the rest. And we can see that they are the sort of impossible standards that mothers in particular have had to meet. And you become hysterical if you. I mean, one sort of. I think it might be someone like Zizek or someone like this who came up with this sort of definition of the hysteric, because the hysteric is a character who's a very subversive figure, a very transgressive figure, because they're too much. But the way in which they transgress our moral codes, our codes of etiquette and propriety, isn't because they're setting out to sort of tear down the law. Their problem is they're trying to do what has been required of them. So the hysteric is somebody who's trying to meet all the standards, and because that's impossible, they expose the system. The system is horribly troubled by the presence of the hysteric, because the hysteric has proven the system doesn't work or can't work for them. And it's because they're setting out to try and do it all, as modern immigrants try to do. Modern immigrants, they're too much. They're getting it wrong by trying to get it right, and they're going too far. They sound too English. They like cricket too much. Whatever it is, and so the modern immigrant experience, the Jewish experience, the too much. Just like everybody else, only more so. And mothers. I mean, I think I mentioned in my book that at least in Mary Poppins, you have the suffragette mother, and then you get the nanny, but the one woman has to be both. She has to be both the suffragette and the nanny. And, she has to be the perfect mother, but also the perfect worker, the perfect citizen, the perfect activist, the perfect feminist. She has to be it all, and she really wants to be it all. She tries, and a kind of explosion happens around her character, and then the world turns and points and says, I blame the mother, I blame the Jew, I blame, the scapegoating function, I think, is quite similar there.
We should wrap up now. I've got plenty more questions, but I think we've reached the hour. But it's been a great pleasure talking to you, Devorah, and thank you for your...
It's a great pleasure talking to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Generosity.
Thank you very, very much for bringing these thoughts to the fore, and I wish we could extend the conversation, but I am so grateful to you both, and it's just wonderful to have you here. I'm very excited. This is my first official event as the festival director for Melbourne Jewish Book Week, so it's been a real honour. I would just like to again mention the Jewish Quarterly. If anyone isn't already a subscriber, we do have a promo code at the moment, MJBW20, and it's only till the end of this month, so we really need to get it's a 20% discount if people wish to subscribe, and also do subscribe to the Melbourne Jewish Book Week newsletter if any listeners haven't already done so. Thank you very much. I hope we can all meet again at some stage. I'm sure this conversation will, as I say, inspire a lot of people to think deeply, and also to go out and read both of your books and download your documentaries or wherever they might be, Devorah. But there's a lot more to be thought about and discussed on this theme.
If I can just say one thing, if I can just spruik Devorah's book and film, which are both out. The book's coming out in May, isn't it? And the film is currently screening on wider release in London and elsewhere. It's called Husband, and the book is called On Marriage, and you might see that there's a connection between the two.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, both of you. Look forward to continuing the conversation outside of this little Zoom session. Good night, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the evening and good day, Devorah. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.